little piece of my heart, yeah. Yeah, I sometimes think I'll try and write a larger memoir, including all kinds of other different fucked up stuff. I'm good. Or did I tell you? Tell me. I'll see. That's how I say it.
Hello, everyone. Hello. So welcome to today's Fellows Colloquium, and we're excited to have our Stuart Hall Fellow, Jordan Camp, speak on Stuart Hall. And we're also very honored that the distinguished Walter Johnson has agreed to do the introduction. He is the Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies. His work focuses on slavery, capitalism, and 19th century imperialism. A prolific author, Professor Johnson's award-winning books include The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of America, Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market, and River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Mississippi Valley's Cotton Kingdom, the second two published by Harvard University Press. His amazing personal essay, Guns in the Family, was included in the 2019 Best American Essays, and it was originally published in the Boston Review, for which he serves as contributing editor. On Agency, published in 2003, is the most cited article in the history of the Journal of Social History and was recently the subject of a special issue of the journal in commemoration of his 20th anniversary. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including those by the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, and Radcliffe. Please welcome Walter Johnson.
That is the Journal of Social History of the Johnson family that she was. Jordan T. Camp is an associate professor of American Studies and the founding co-director of the Social Justice Institute at Trinity College, Stuart Hall Fellow at the Hutchins Center for African American Research at Harvard University. He is the author of Incarcerating the Crisis, Freedom Struggles, and the Rise of the Neoliberal State, which I think probably many of you, was a guide for me through the years after 2016. Co-editor with Christine Heatherton of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, published by Verso in 2016, and co-editor with Laura Polito of the late Clyde Woods development, Drowned and Reborn, the Blues and Bourbon Restorations in the Post-Katrina New Orleans and Post-Katrina New Orleans. University of Georgia Press, 2017. Co-host and producer of Conjunctural, a podcast and web series inspired by Antonio Gramsci and Stuart Hall, and currently editing an anthology, again with Heatherton, entitled Conjuncture, working on a new book entitled The Southern Question, from which we're going to be hearing a piece today, under contract to be published in the American Crossroads series at the University of California Press. If you're going to imagine a radical politics in the United States of America, you have to imagine a Southern strategy. John Brown had a Southern strategy. Martin Luther King had a Southern strategy. Jesse Jackson had a Southern strategy. Bernie Sanders lacked a Southern strategy, right? You got to imagine that strategy. And that strategy has to be incredibly difficult and as yet resolve problems on the left. So I'm not even certain that that's what Jordan is going to be talking about, but it is with the greatest degree of excitement and even a tiny little measure of hope, not that already defeated hope as a discipline that we all got to have, but that kind of goofy, optimistic hope that I introduce Jordan Camp.
Well, good afternoon. I first just want to really thank Walter Johnson for the really kind introduction. We met over a decade ago, and I feel very fortunate to have this chance to be on campus and in dialogue, and look forward to his biography on John Brown. So I'm also really grateful to Professor Gates and the Hutchins Center for hosting me this semester. I want to acknowledge the staff, Mike, Corvo, and particularly thank Krishna Lewis for making my time here so generative. And I couldn't be more honored or delighted to have received a fellowship named after Stuart Hall. It's enabled me to have the time to do my research and writing, but also to be in dialogue with the wonderful people in the Stuart Hall Foundation in London, and their encouragement and support has been really meaningful and helped sharpen my arguments considerably. So I'm delighted to be given a talk on Hall in this distinguished colloquium, particularly after Phoebe Braithwaite's wonderful talk on Hall last week. And I look forward to learning from all the presentations from the fellows that will follow. So today's talk, The Southern Question, Stuart Hall, Translation, and the Challenge of the Right, I'm going to share some of my new research on Jamaican-born British New Left public intellectual and theorist Stuart Hall and his conjunctural analysis of racism, authoritarian populist nationalism, and capitalism during the long 20th and early 21st centuries. Hall, of course, wrote, spoke, and organized extensively around the challenge of the right in his own time. And I'm interested in how we might translate his theoretical insights in order to better understand the challenge of the right in our own. So today's talk is part of a larger body of scholarship drawing on Hall and the writings of Antonio Gramsci to provide conjunctural analyses of racial capitalism, the neoliberal carceral state, policing, prisons, and cultures of opposition. My new book, The Southern Questions, focuses on a series of moments of resistance to the far right, and Walter will be glad to know, in the American South and across the world, from the overthrow of Reconstruction in the South in the 19th century right down to the present. So this work similarly utilizes conjunctural analysis and extends the insights of my first book, Incarcerating the Crisis, while expanding the global scale of the argument. I take as my analytical point of departure W.B. Du Bois's classic book, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, which I read in relation to the unfinished 1926 essay by Antonio Gramsci entitled Some Aspects of the Southern Question, which is obviously the source of the title for my book. In doing so, the Southern Question extends its comparative and relational conjunctural analysis to places where racist and authoritarian nationalist politics similarly proliferated, like the Jim Crow South, apartheid South Africa, Imperial Britain, and the revanchist United States in the present. It draws on the political, theoretical writings of Du Bois, Gramsci, Hall, Ruth First, C.L.R. James, Angela Davis, and Walter Rodney. Drawing on this archive of radical political and social theory, the book traces the interconnected historical geographies of racism, capitalism, and authoritarianism in the global South and the global North, and the multiple Souths within. In today's talk, I offer a read of Hall's archive to suggest the potential contributions of his conjunctural analysis of racist authoritarianisms in and for our present. So without further ado, let me just jump right into it. In January 1979, Hall published the groundbreaking essay, the Great Moving Right Show. He mobilized Antonio Gramsci to theorize how the, quote, swing to the right, unquote, was less a reflection of and more a political response to an organic crisis that had taken shape since the late 1960s. The essay first introduced the concept of Thatcherism to describe an authoritarian response to a crisis of the state and for capitalism. The politics of Thatcherism, including the promotion of racist programs, law and order, and a hegemonic project to roll back the victories of labor and social movements. It mobilized, as Hall put it, the populist resentment of what he described as the petty bourgeois or middle strata against, and I'm quoting him here, elites, big government, and for law and order, free markets, and a strong state. Drawing on Gramsci, Hall famously argued that one had to deal with the specific features of the far right and recognized that it was engaged in a struggle for hegemony. In doing so, he noted that this shift toward the right marked a move towards what he called authoritarian populism, a, quote, exceptional form of capitalist state that had been able to secure an active popular consent. Now, Hall warned that the production of consent to authoritarian state forms had not adequately captured the attention of the left. In his judgment, the, quote, full dimensions of the precipitation to the right continues to evade proper analysis, close quote. The problem was due to the ways that the crisis was read by the left within certain well-established and respectable common sense positions, ones which Hall writes no longer provide an adequate analytic or theoretical framework. The politics which flow from them thus continue to fall short of their aim. In this way, Hall suggests the political stakes in the development of an adequate theoretical framework for understanding and confronting the resurgence of the racist far right in this decisive conjunctural moment in the history of capitalism. Now, Hall engaged in political theoretical work to translate Gramsci's theoretical insights into a new conjuncture that took shape in response to a crisis of capitalism in the 1970s. He warned against the temptation to pluck, as he put it, Gramsci's writings out of context and expect them to answer the new questions facing political and social movements in the late 20th century. He illuminates the importance of Gramsci's conjunctural analysis of fascism for confronting the articulation of racism and authoritarian nationalism in his time. He encourages readers to, quote, address ourselves violently toward the present as it is if we are serious about transforming it. Hall's Gramscian conjunctural analysis connected the neoliberal counter-revolution to the rise of the authoritarian right in ways that critically prefigure our present. Gramsci's method of conjunctural analysis and his theory of translatability provides an alternative to the plucking that Hall warned about. Gramsci's prison writings explore how organic intellectuals can more effectively translate their theoretical insights from one conjuncture in the history of capitalism to another. Hall translated Gramsci's insights to understand the relationship between the point in the history of capitalism and the resurgence of the racist far right during the neoliberal turn. Our task is to translate Hall's insights into the present situation in the US and the world, a moment when neoliberalism is unable to command the consent that it once did. There's been a renewed interest in Hall's Gramscian conjunctural analysis following the republication of Policing the Crisis, the 35th anniversary edition pictured here, his passing in 2014, and the expansion of anti-racist labor struggles and the resurgence of the racist far right over the last decade. This growing body of scholarship suggests that his approach to conjunctural analysis can be adapted to understand the articulations of race, class, gender, sexuality, and authoritarian and fascist nationalisms in different places, from Europe, North America, the Caribbean, Southern Africa, and many other regions of the world. But rather than asking what Hall would say about the authoritarian populist politics of the present, I suggest that we follow his lead and seek to theorize how, quote, different forces come together conjuncturally to create the new terrain on which a different politics must form up, close quote. So the resurgence of racist and authoritarian nationalism in the US and across the world, excuse me, get some water, is not incidental to this moment of crisis. There's a growing articulation in Hall's sense as joining and bringing together the global far right against so-called globalism, the deep state, immigration, and beyond. Returning to Hall's archive, in today's lecture, I hope to illuminate the potential political contribution of conjunctural analysis for confronting the present. Drawing on his political theoretical writings, as well as unpublished materials and videos from the newly opened Stuart Hall Archive at the University of Birmingham, I begin by exploring how Hall engaged deeply with Gramsci's writings to develop his own conjunctural analysis of racism and capitalism and a translatable theory of authoritarian populism. I consider how he theorized the historically specific form right-wing populism took during the, quote, regressive modernization, unquote, of Britain with the rise of Thatcherism. I show how he elaborated a distinct conjunctural framework for analyzing racism, capitalism, and authoritarian nationalism in dialogue with a number of theorists in London during this period, including Trinidadian-born anti-apartheid activist and intellectual Marian O'Callaghan, South African theorist in exile Harold Wolpe, Greek Marxist theorist Nikos Poulantzas, and socialist feminist geographer Doreen Massey. These dialogues illustrate how politics and geography shape the practice of conjunctural analysis. Through them, I seek to recover a sense of the political stakes in Hall's approach to the analysis of situations. I demonstrate the importance of theorizing the precise forms that racism and authoritarian nationalism take in particular conjunctures. And I suggest that there are aspects of Hall's method that have not yet been fully appreciated in the literatures on the histories and geographies of capitalism and authoritarianism. I trace the development of his Gramscian conjunctural analysis through a series of speeches, broadcasts, and other forms of organic intellectual work that have not yet been fully considered in the intellectual histories tracing his work in this period. In turn, I hope to show how these interventions informed the subsequent development of his game-changing collaborative work entitled Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State, Law and Order, which I have the original cover here. At the same time, my task is to translate Hall into our current moment. And in doing so, I want us to consider his methodological criteria in analyzing the Southern question in our time, marked by relentless racism and vigilantism, climate chaos, gender violence, mass migration, and the resurgence of explicitly racist and neo-fascist forms of right-wing populism on a scale not seen at least since the 1970s and maybe the 1930s or even the 1870s. In this explosive conjuncture, I argue Hall's conjunctural analysis developed in the 70s remains relevant in the US and across the world in the 2020s. Hey, Shana. I conclude by suggesting how we might establish historical geographies of capitalism in order to stimulate new insights about the reproduction of racisms and authoritarian and fascist nationalisms in our crisis-ridden present. I keep turning around looking for a place to put my paper. Hall's most significant contributions to politics and theory are tied to his analysis of specific conjunctures. Now, by conjunctures, Hall was referring to Gramsci's conceptualization of historical moments and geographical contexts where the relation of political, economic, military, and social forces enter into a distinct shape, as he put it. Now, Gramsci developed his conjunctural analysis during the rise of Benito Mussolini in Italy in the post-World War I period. His conjunctural analysis was critical for grappling with the specific situation with the rise of fascism. He emphasized the need to develop anti-fascist strategies rooted in a concrete analysis of the Italian situation. The analysis of situations was key to Gramsci's method, outlined in his essay on some aspects of the Southern question and elaborated in Notebook 1 of his prison notebooks with a focus on Italian society as a whole. In doing so, it provided an expanded conception of hegemony, ideology, and the state. And you can see in his archives really wonderful notes and get a sense of how he's developing this analysis and dialogue with his students and colleagues at Birmingham. Now, Hall extended Gramsci's conjunctural analysis of fascism to theorize the racism and nationalism that took shape in response to a crisis of the 70s. In their respective times and places, both showed that concrete analyses of the relations of force and the politics of hegemony were needed to develop effective interventions in the moment. For Hall, conjunctural analysis proceeds through a recognition that politics is open-ended, a product of a concrete relations of force, operating in specific historical and geographical context. Like Gramsci, he argued for the importance of analyzing the interrelations between the organic and the conjunctural, where the former refers to the long-term structural features, or you could think of as the longue durée of the development of capitalism, and the latter to the, quote, immediate terrain of struggle, unquote, or the terrain of the conjunctural. Hall honed his approach to conjunctural analysis in order to understand, again, the articulation between racism, uneven capitalist development, and authoritarian state formation in this period. He drew on close readings of Karl Marx's recently translated Introduction to the Grundrisse, published in '73, The Civil War in France, and the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser's For Marx, which was first published in English in '69, though I think Hall may have been reading it in French before then, and Gramsci's recently translated Selections from the Prison Notebooks, which appears on a large scale in English, really, for the first time in 1971. Hall then translated their insights to understand the challenges of a specific political and theoretical conjuncture, one that was marked by what he called a long crisis of hegemony for the state, the worst economic downturn since the 30s, and the struggles of Black and Asian migrant workers, and the rise of an anti-immigrant far right. In doing so, he demonstrated the potential of conjunctural analysis and struggles to shift the common sense as part of what he described as a struggle for hegemony. In 1975, Hall released a documentary pictured here, Mugging, a Case Study in Communication, as part of a foundation course in the social sciences that was produced in collaboration with the Open University and BBC Television. This unique cultural production has not been fully considered in work tracing the development of Hall's approach to conjunctural analysis and to theorizing common sense. This new university had been established in '69 and used the vacant former BBC studios to launch an ambitious project of public education and pedagogy. It began broadcasting courses on radio and television in collaboration in 1971. This documentary, I think, represents an early appropriation of Gramsci's concept of common sense to understand the representation of mugging in the British media as a case study. Now, Hall was concerned with understanding the relationship between mass media representations, the production of common sense, and the political economy of the period. He explained the role of common sense in the production of meaning about mugging and provided a Gramscian perspective that reached beyond the cultural studies classroom and the campus to contribute to public debates of considerable urgency. In this way, he theorized how the mugging label called up mediated images of violent street criminals, but in fact was symptomatic of a much deeper crisis of hegemony. In turn, he employs the concept of mugging as a moral panic, or a stereotypical depiction of the problem that justified a response that exceeded the actual threat, which Hall described as sparking a kind of, quote, tailspin about a troubling issue, close quote. Now, mugging, a case study in communication, provides a relational analysis of this moral panic around mugging that's taking shape under these crisis conditions in Britain in this precise historical context. And it begins by scrolling through headlines in the British press about mugging. I'll read a few of them. Dealing with the outbreak of mugging. War starts on muggers. Judge gives severe warning on mugging. Or you can see here from the Daily News, you know, about mugs, drugs, the city's in terror, right? Bois, 16, weeps after sentence of 20 years for mugging. Now, Hall notes that 20 years for a 16-year-old was excessive. And the, quote, fact that he is weeping in court does not suggest that he's a hardened criminal, close quote. At the same time, he explains how the British media interest in mugging and the reaction to it began with attention to a local case in Handsworth, Birmingham. 3 teenagers from different backgrounds had been charged with exorbitant sentences after robbing and injuring a man who was walking home from the pub. These sentences seemed to Hall and his colleagues to be outrageous, and they understood that the political reaction, again, exceeded the actual threat. After all, the mugging label, Hall explains, had not referred to a crime until 1972, and there were no statistics until 1973. He provides a comparative method of reading how the mugging label was imported from Harlem to Handsworth, as you can maybe kind of see here from these stills from that old documentary. It suggests how it was common in British media to frame certain American stories as a kind of cautionary tales. You see here, New York, a kind of lesson for the world. Hall specifically notes how Tory minister and far-right populist Enoch Powell employed geographical references about the U.S. as a warning about purported threats of immigration to the UK. Only a few years before, Powell had delivered his infamous Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham on April 20th, 1968. The speech famously appealed to a racist and nationalist common sense that took shape in the aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis on April 4th of 1968. The assassination led poor and working people to protest by burning and looting in at least 130 cities in the United States. As Hall observed, in response, the state deployed troops, or he didn't observe this, the state deployed troops to crush the uprisings. What he does observe, though, is that the state began relying on more coercive resolutions. In the aftermath of the events of '68, the transatlantic elite lost its ability to govern through popular consent. Powell's speech produced space for the expansion of neo-fascist organizations like the National Front. In this turbulent context, Hall signaled the political challenges of what he called Powellism and the ways in which it enabled a reactionary, populist, anti-immigrant rhetoric to legitimate authoritarian resolutions of a growing legitimacy crisis. The production of an anti-immigrant common sense was one of the central challenges of his time. Hall explained how the police themselves helped construct this common sense by creating narratives about increasing crime in African, Caribbean, and South Asian migrant communities by selectively enforcing certain crimes, which the British media uncritically parroted as statistics indicating an increase in crime. As Hall observed, the media depended on primary definers of crime such as the police, which reinforced the institutional links between those who define and control crime in political society and those who report it in the media within civil society. The state's reaction to mugging, therefore, depends on interpretation, labeling, and prediction in media, which taken together play a key role in shaping the meaning and memory of turbulent events. Hall concludes by tracing a series of panics about crime, violence, protests, strikes, and economic uncertainty in the period. In doing so, he shows how the label muggings could be understood as part of a broader crisis, and warns that what they demand was not just more understanding, but more authoritarian forms of social control. In this way, the film both predates as well as anticipates and informs the subsequent development of policing the crisis. And I've got a picture of the working papers here and some of the archive that he was working on or from at Birmingham. They gathered all these kind of right-wing, newspapers to analyze as their archive. And between 1973 and 1978, Hall and his Birmingham colleagues, and I'll mention them because this often says Hall wrote this book, but it's Charles Critcher, Tony Jefferson, John Clark, and Brian Roberts. They researched and wrote this over a 5-year period. And they emphasized the importance of conjunctural analysis for understanding the political, economic, and ideological crisis of the 70s. They worked to understand the articulations of race, class, gender, and state power. And they produced a series of these working papers trying to theorize how a tilt towards authoritarianism was taking place in response to this crisis of hegemony or authority. And in turn, they argued that the state was sanctioned to deploy force against a racialized enemy of purported criminals through a series of panics about crime and law and order. As such, race provided the, quote, correlative of the crisis, unquote. And that is, to kind of paraphrase him, the terrain in which, or them, class anxieties were worked through. To paraphrase their famous insight, race was the modality through which class was experienced, lived, and fought out. And they go on to argue, therefore, that languages of race and crime and law and order could provide a prism through which, and I'm quoting here, the whole conjuncture could be read symptomatically. By examining the articulation of racism and policing, the work essentially connects the making of an authoritarian state to the neoliberal counter-revolution. Now, some of Hall's earlier thinking, pardon me for a second, is evident in Policing the Crisis' famous final chapter, The Politics of Mugging. It notes how the neo-fascist National Front marched specifically against black muggings, quote unquote. It shows that when protesters came out to resist, that the, quote, race issue had entered the streets, close quote. At the same time, it illustrates how explicitly racist and fascist organizations had been organizing around the race issue since the 50s, including the Mosleyites, or supporters of Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, in the 1958 Notting Hill riots, which of course Hall had observed and had written about. Yet the formation of the National Front in 1966, according to Policing the Crisis, represented a new challenge of the right. It no longer used the symbolism of pre-World War II fascism, but it did promote, quote, explicitly racist, anti-immigrant policies and hardline policies on law and order. These organizations combined antipathy, right, and apparently anti-elitist themes from what they describe as the National Socialist repertoire, anti-bankers, anti-big business, and they were for the oppressed, for the small man, right? And they argued that this served to kind of whip up anxieties by white workers in the midst of an economic crisis. In turn, Policing the Crisis shows how, and this is crucial, quote, capital reproduces the class as a whole, structured by race. The book concludes by suggesting the need for organized political struggle to confront these racist and authoritarian populist projects. So as many in this room are no doubt aware, Policing the Crisis has become a landmark work of conjunctural analysis. It provides an original and generative understanding of the formation of a racialized authoritarian state as a political response to the crisis of the 60s and 70s, a moment, I might add, that was marked by the resurgence of labor struggle in Northwestern and Southern Europe on a scale not seen since the 30s. It represented a decisive contribution to political and social theory for its intervention that the relationship between racism and capitalism was not incidental or epiphenomenal, but rather structural features of the political economy. In this way, Hall and his colleagues offered important theoretical insights about the relationship between histories of capitalism and the reproduction of racism and authoritarianism in its present. His engagement with Birmingham's Policing the Crisis Collective provided the foundations for his subsequent work. He leaves Birmingham in '79. He takes a position at the Open University. He moves into the Department of Sociology, where he's working for the next couple of decades. And in these timely interventions, Hall engaged with the work of Nikos Poulantzas, pictured here, in particular his idea of authoritarian statism, as he sought to theorize the challenges of the right during early neoliberalism. Now, Poulantzas had famously argued that a new phase of capitalism had given rise to a new authoritarian state form that was marked by a decline in democratic participation and increasingly centralized state power. He specified, though, that the state, like capital, is not simply a relationship, but a condensation in the relations of forces, and a mechanism, as he put it, for organizing social space. Now, Hall saw important resonances between Poulantzas' project and the project of policing the crisis, and he identified, though, that Poulantzas had neglected the anti-statist strategy of the far right. He identified how the far right had secured consent by the incorporation of elements of opposition into their program, and described how this consent to authoritarian populism had been rooted in a kind of racist discontent. In this work, Hall anticipated how the rise of the populist right would be the central challenge of the neoliberal era. And he developed this theory of authoritarian populism amidst what he called the heat of conjunctural analysis in order to theorize the right as it unfolded. So I think this has been a relatively neglected dialogue with Poulantzas, though there are encouraging signs that more will be delving into these discussions. As a result, I think the fact that some of the most innovative contributions about authoritarianism emerged through a dialogue have not been fully appreciated. In 1976, for example, Hall delivered a talk with Poulantzas present. This dynamic presentation added to Hall's reputation as a leading New Left theorist and one of the most dynamic speakers to have emerged in decades. In a subsequent interview that he and Alan Hunt conducted with Poulantzas, the two theorists reflect on questions of theory, political practice, and the implications of the theory of the state as a condensation and relations of force for movement building and for anti-authoritarian politics. Now, scholars have subsequently taken up and extended Hall on his read of Gramsci and Poulantzas in a variety of contexts: the authoritarian state in Britain, post-apartheid South Africa, the neoliberal carceral state in the US and beyond. And taken together, this growing body of scholarship complicates, I think, the most influential narratives about the historical geography of capitalism, such as those promoted by David Harvey. This work demonstrates that neoliberalism is not only a project of class restoration, as Harvey puts it. Instead, as I argue in Incarcerating the Crisis, neoliberalism is a contradictory hegemonic project that deploys racialized narratives of security, law, and order to justify the expansion of policing, prisons, and permanent war. The social consequences of this hegemonic project have been manifest in nationalist articulations of race and class linked with a racist common sense about crime that paved the way for the rise of the neoliberal carceral state. Racist ideologies and projects facilitated the implementation of neoliberal policies And as Christina Heatherton and I have argued elsewhere, it offered hegemonic strategies that rendered people simultaneously less worthy of the state's shrunken largesse and more deserving of its expanding punitive capacities. In this way, Hall's analysis has led geographers, historians, and social theorists to analyze conjunctures as less slices of time and more an accumulation of contradictions. Such moments represent ruptures in the relations of force, but they do not necessarily lead to emancipatory social transformation. They represent situations where hegemony can be, as they put it, restored through a modification in the modes of hegemony, which enable, I think, understandings of hegemony as a process that enables capitalism to survive. Hall's writings show the political and theoretical stakes in interpreting this moment and in being attentive to the production of a historically specific common sense, one that mediates crises of the state and capital at different geographical scales. In 1980, Hall published the groundbreaking essay, Race, Articulation, and Society's Structured and Dominance, in a UNESCO anthology on social theories of racism and colonialism. He had been working on a number of drafts of this important intervention since before the publication of Policing the Crisis. I found one in the archive going back to the mid-1970s following some other scholars like Gillian Hart. And this essay, as she argues, represents a decisive intervention in the race and class debate that was rocking South Africa during the 80s. And here, Hall again mobilized this insight first developed in Policing the Crisis, right? Or maybe it's actually here first. We don't know which one's first, right? But about race being the modality through which class is lived. And in doing so, he provided a politically powerful analysis, particularly for the liberation movements against South African racial capitalism. Now, during this period, opponents of South African apartheid, as a number of scholars have shown, such as Martin Legasek, Shula Marx, and Harold Wolpe, who was Hall's close friend, apparently they both lived in North London, and they had been exiled into the UK, and worked to provide an alternative to the liberal historiography and sociology of apartheid. This liberal tradition had been resistant to ideas that linked racism, or white racism, to capitalism and imperialism. And these South African intellectuals sought to illuminate those connections and to present an alternative to the liberal narratives, which purported that white racism could be overcome through capitalist development. This line of argument aligned with Hall's writing on race and class in the same moment. Both projects influenced one another through transatlantic dialogues that were taking place. In this way, we can see Hall's work making decisive interventions that shaped the debate about racism and capitalism. Drawing from these dialogues in Southern Africa, for example, John Saul and Stephen Gelb employ Hall's Gramscian framework to theorize the, quote, organic crisis of South Africa's racial capitalism. They're doing that in 81, 82. And they illuminate the growing resistance to it from the, quote, dominated classes, unquote, and suggest the implications of his method for the political practice of those who were concerned to support the struggle against apartheid and settler colonialism in South Africa. In 85, Hall also delivered the important lecture, Gramsci's Relevance for the Study of Racism and Ethnicity, at a UNESCO seminar pictured here on theories of race and ethnicity that took place in Milan, Italy. Now, the talk was the basis for his now famous essay, probably everyone's read, that we can just refer to in short as Gramsci's Relevance. And in that essay, of course, he illuminated Gramsci's, the importance of Gramsci's core concepts and method, particularly his attention to the, quote, complex dialectic of class and regional factors, close quote, for theorizing racism and uneven capitalist development. And he argued that Gramsci's relevance in the field stemmed from his emphasis on historical specificity, his innovative method, and his concepts, hegemony, ideology, common sense, blocks, alliances, the Southern question. Hall then demonstrates the political stakes again in theorizing the precise forms that racism takes in particular times and places. For Hall, the idea that racism is transhistorical is spurious because it depends on the common sense notion that, quote, racism everywhere is a deeply anti-human and anti-social practice, and therefore it's everywhere the same. Hall's use of Gramscian conjunctural analysis helped disrupt an imagined fixity of racism, revealing the geography of what he called racisms. Now, in Gramsci's relevance, Hall elaborates Gramsci's spatial insights about racism in southern Italy in relationship to the uneven development of world capitalism. He notes how Gramsci's attention to the uneven geographies between the Italian North and the Italian South. In this essay, I mentioned some aspects of the Southern question, which was interrupted by his arrest by fascists in November of 1926. It was here that Gramsci argued for specific attention to spaces of uneven development and to the struggles of workers in the Italian North, in Turin, where he had gone to college and was the epicenter of capitalist production, and the struggles of peasants in the Italian South, where he had grown up. He was born in Sardinia. He was, after all, a Southerner. He also was attentive to the geography of imperialism in Africa. And so as Hall observed, these geographical insights were essential to the method that he develops in his prison notebooks. And he argued that Gramsci provided key methodological criteria for analyzing the articulation of racism and capitalism in different historical geographical contexts, including the underdeveloped areas of southern Italy, the unevenly developed economies of Asia and Latin America, slavery and settler colonialism's centrality to the accumulation of capital in North America, the super-exploitation of migrant workers in Europe, and the presence of Bantustans within the capitalist political economy of Southern Africa. Gramsci's relevance took up and extended his interventions about theorizing racism and capitalism in the Caribbean and Southern Africa in the series of UNESCO seminars during the 70s and 80s. And as Paul Gilroy notes, Hall's participation in these seminars were organized by Trinidadian-born novelist, nonfiction writer, and anti-apartheid intellectual Marion O'Callaghan, pictured here, also known as Marion Patrick Jones, who Phoebe also mentioned last week. Now, O'Callaghan also served as UNESCO's director of social science and anti-apartheid programs in Paris from the mid-60s to about 1990. She edited and introduced the anthology Sociological Theories. You can see here that was where that famous essay on race articulation, societies structured in dominance, would appear. And so taken together, I think that these essays and writings in this period represented decisive, interventions about how to read issues, emerging issues of racial capitalism, settler colonialism, and authoritarian state forms. I'm going to keep my voice through this. Yet there has been some controversy about Hall's assertion that Gramsci, quote, did not write directly about race, ethnicity, or racism, close quote. Scholars have demonstrated that Gramsci clearly wrote about race and racism and suggested that Hall's reading suffered from a lack of attention to his core text. But as Hall noted, if you look, that you didn't have the critical editions, the Joseph Buttigieg's 3-volume set that starts being published in the 90s and 2000s aren't available. You're working basically with the letters and that 71 edition. And I think recent publications, including an important volume on subaltern groups and social classes, have offered a more complete view. But after all, Gramsci clearly observes in Notebook 1 of the prison notebooks that the, quote, poverty of the South was historically inexplicable to the Northern popular masses who failed to understand the, quote, hegemony of the North over the South in a city-country territorial relation. Instead, Gramsci writes that the workers of the North thought the peasants were poor because of their organic incapacity, their barbarity, their biological inferiority, close quote. These dynamics led Gramsci to observe a, quote, North-South polemic about race and about the superiority and inferiority of North and South. He uniquely demonstrated how racist ideas had gripped the imagination of people in the North who went on believing that industrial capitalism would have prospered if not for the dead weight of the South. In this way, Gramsci demonstrates how the racist construction of the Italian South took shape as part of an effort to produce a translatable theory of anti-fascist alliances. But at the same time, it's also clear that Hall's read of Gramsci was central to his contribution to the race and class debate in this period. He intervened that the production of racial difference could be understood as a set of political, ideological, and economic antagonisms. He argued that Gramsci's concepts like hegemony, organic intellectuals, and common sense could be used in the study of politics and racist and settler colonial societies like South Africa. He makes a similar argument about the state, which had been routinely defined as kind of exclusively coercive, dominative, no consent required at all. And in doing so, he was working to provide an alternative to the ways in which a kind of nationalist common sense had obscured the political and economic character of South-North relations, as geographers Stefan Kipfer and Ayaz Malik have put it. During an organic crisis of apartheid in South Africa, the consolidation of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's reign in the US and the UK, and the neoliberal turn in global capitalism, Hall provided an analysis to understand the challenge of the right and the expansion of authoritarian state as a solution to crisis. And as Hall and his Birmingham colleagues argue in the preface to the 35th anniversary of Policing the Crisis, released in 2013, this long vendetta is still working its way through the political culture. In this moment, Hall particularly directs our attention to the role of what Gramsci called organic intellectuals, as organizers who can transform common sense that, quote, take root and help to shape popular life. In doing so, he considered how there was a new common sense that was being re-articulated after the defeat of the US in Vietnam in the 1970s, a terrible economic downturn, and a shift in the epicenter of US militarism and counterinsurgency towards the Americas, the Middle East, and Southern Africa in the late Cold War. In turn, far-right movements experienced a surge in membership as Thatcher was elected in Britain and Reagan rode a wave of reaction into the White House based on his message, "Let's make America great again," that were widely circulated in the campaign materials from this period. So in his read, by which I mean Hall's read of the conjuncture, Hall noted particularly how Thatcher's rhetoric of security, law, and order appealed to simple moral codes by essentially depicting welfare or the bad behavior of poor and working people and people of color as the source of their own problems. Right? He and his colleagues uniquely theorized how consent to Thatcherism and authoritarianism was related to the promotion of these kind of moralist, populist narratives. And they used this idea of populist common sense in the way that Gramsci did to theorize how this message to the middle strata that their problems were not caused by transformations in the political economy, but rather by race riots, by criminality, by the violence of black workers, of the unemployed, of the quote-unquote young immigrants, rather than uneven capitalist development or resurgent American and British imperialism. These racist narratives were deployed at the very moment that poor and working people found themselves experiencing increasing poverty, unemployment due to capital flight, bloated military budgets in support of British counterinsurgencies in Northern Ireland, new forms of hegemony in the Caribbean and South Africa, and the consolidation of authoritarian neoliberalism across the global South and the global North. As Hall taught us, conjunctural analysis involves looking concretely at the relations of force in a particular region to effectively intervene. So from his theoretical work on Gramsci in Birmingham to his conjunctural analysis of race and class in those UNESCO seminars, he demonstrated how to intervene in precise conjunctures and in doing so change the world. As such, I think his writings remain an indispensable point of departure for theorizing the challenges of the right in our own time. So I'm going to start this last section with three quotes. I put them here so you could read them along with me. Hopefully you can see that. The first is from Enoch Powell, 1968, the Rivers of Blood speech. The immigrant communities can organize to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest. As I look ahead, I'm filled with foreboding, like the Roman. I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. The next quote's from Donald Trump, from 2023 at a campaign rally. They let, I think the real number is 15, 16 million people into our country. When they do that, we got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country, close quote. Finally, from Stuart Hall in his wonderful book, The Hard Road to Renewal, submit everything to the discipline of the present reality, to our understanding of the forces which are really shaping and changing our world. What we have to explain, Hall observed in the 1980s, is a, quote, move towards authoritarian populism. Again, an exceptional form of capitalist state, which, unlike classical fascism, it's important, Hall absolutely refused to describe Thatcherism as a form of fascism, had retained most, though not all, of its formal representative institutions in place, and which at the same time had been able to construct itself around an active popular consent. Hall's attention to the production of consent to authoritarianism is key. It provides its readers with a guide to understanding and confronting the specific form of racialized, authoritarian, nationalist, populist politics in Thatcher's Britain. He illustrates how these politics, again, took shape in response to a moment of crisis. Now, while Hall penned his analyses to face the specific challenges of his time, his interventions continue to have direct relevance for understanding and confronting the reproductions of racisms and authoritarian nationalisms of our present. As he and feminist geographer Doreen Massey observed in the wake of the 2008 crisis in the journal they co-founded entitled Soundings, the resolution of a crisis is not determined in advance. It's an outcome of a political and ideological struggle. In this moment, they argued you could see the expansion of authoritarian movements and state forms. Or intellectuals, theorists, organizers could seize on the moment to articulate an alternative common sense, an alternative hegemonic project, and an alternative vision of democratic transformation. But our challenge remains to translate Hall, to confront the historically and specific ways in which a tilt towards authoritarianism and I think fascist nationalism has taken place around the world today. In view of the global resurgence of the far right in the wake of Hall's passing in 2014, it's worth considering how we might reconstruct the practice of conjunctural analysis to theorize the specific articulations of racism, of capitalism, and authoritarian nationalisms in our time. Indeed, one of the most pressing challenges of the present is the resurgence of right-wing or neo-fascist forms of populism within the US, the most powerful capitalist state on the planet, with the largest military, carceral state, and surveillance apparatus in the world. In this context, it's important to consider how to effectively theorize the present, where Donald Trump's return as leader of the Republican Party is related to his authoritarian nationalist project to criminalize migrants and promote law and order. His nationalist rhetoric of poisoning the blood should compel us to consider how it represents the Southern question in our time, namely the criminalization of mass migration from the global South to the global North due to decades of capitalist globalization, ecological catastrophe, the privatization of urban and rural spaces, neo-fascism, and permanent war. Now, Gramsci insisted on the importance of building alliances between what he called the subaltern groups and classes across the geographical boundaries of North and South. And he argued that it was critical to understand how his theory of alliances was premised on understanding of how the development of capitalism in Northern Italy depended on low-wage migrant labor from Southern Italy. This represented a form of uneven capitalist development that we now see on a global scale. In this moment, I think the Southern question remains a central issue for building popular alliances in a moment of globalization, mass migration, and the resurgence of an anti-immigrant far right. Now, Hall's Gramscian approach to the Southern question is important for a few reasons. But first, I want to argue that we need to, following Hall, distinguish the far-right movements of our time from the forms of pre-World War II fascism. Analogies won't do for understanding this problem. Translating Hall into the present, I think, encourages us to ask, what does Trump's reemergence as the leader of the far right in the United States teach us about the current conjuncture in North America and the world? Does Trumpism represent the resurgence of authoritarian populism, or is Trump a neo-fascist? How do we understand the links between resurgent racisms and authoritarian nationalisms in the US and UK, Italy, Hungary, India, Israel, Russia, and beyond? Is there a chain of equivalence between Trump, Meloni, Modi, Netanyahu, Orban, and Putin? What concepts are critical for advancing an analysis of the situation adequate to the challenges of our time? We can approach these questions through an analysis of the situation informed by Gramsci and Hall, one that recognizes there's no way to adequately theorize racism and authoritarian nationalism without locating them within what Gillian Hart describes as critical conjunctural moments or turning points where she puts it interconnected forces at play at multiple levels and at different scales in different regions come together to create worldwide reverberations. So rather than simply drawing lines of equivalence between individuals like Trump, Modi, Meloni, conjunctural analysis allows us to theorize the global processes that have led to challenges to hegemony from the right. It can help us develop new ways of seeing our moment, marked by this organic crisis of US hegemony, failed wars on Afghanistan and Iraq, the global COVID-19 pandemic, the US support for Israel's war on Gaza, and one of the largest refugee crises since World War II. For Hall, crises are moments of rupture, when the social formation is no longer able to reproduce itself in the ways that it normally does. Adopting Hall's approach, we can better understand how Trump and Trumpism have combined racism and xenophobic nationalism into a contradictory hegemonic project to ensure capitalism's survival. In translating Hall, I argue for a focus on the specific works that racism and nationalism achieves in this present moment. Conjunctural analysis of how common sense changes across time or over time and across space is important because it establishes the language through which politics takes place. In the US, Trump and his allies articulate an authoritarian or neo-fascist common sense to justify the racist construction of enemies, displacing more fundamental class antagonisms and conflicts. In this context, conjunctural analysis provides a way of seeing how the relationships between neo-fascist common sense take place and what can be done, or racist and neo-fascist common sense take shape and what can be done to confront them. It enables us to grasp the articulations of racism, extreme authoritarian nationalism, and capitalism in the sense of linking them, but it also can, I think, allow us to address gaps in Hall's analyses through attention to gender and sexuality as constitutive of nationalisms in the US and across the world, which we can see in his attacks on abortion rights, transgender policies, and so-called gender ideology. Yet conjunctural analysis also provides a method of political work for analyzing the present and for understanding organizations of subaltern groups and classes in particular times and places that reverberate around the world. In Hall's time, Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech appealed to racism and nationalism as common sense. Following dramatic increases in unemployment, wealth inequality, and social polarization after 2008, the interests of hegemonic fractions of the elite have become increasingly disconnected from the majority of the people in this country. Trump's return as the leader of the Republican Party has featured a vengeance that demonstrates the far right's commitment to shoring up consent to authoritarian resolution of crisis. He suggested to crowds at his rallies throughout the 2024 election that this political task is to, quote him, root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our society, that lie and cheat on elections, close quote. He appeals to white racism, heteropatriarchy, and xenophobic nationalism as common sense. Trump is actually pushing ICE to increase state capacity to deport undocumented workers. These plans seek to enable the existing infrastructure of policing, prison, and detentions to jump scales. This far-right white nationalist program has been accompanied by the production of common sense, and it's critical to building up alliances amongst the kind of disenchanted and resentful middle strata. They're increasingly unified by a desire to destroy a common enemy, and that enemy moves around: migrants, trans people, black people, political Islam, and on, and protect the purity of the nation. In this way, it not only appeals to a white Christian nationalist base, but increasingly a multiracial, transnational far-right movement. I think it's important to grapple with how Trump can articulate or bring together previously separate forces by playing the anti-immigrant misogynist playbook and by promoting political violence against enemies of the nation as a part of a long vendetta. These projects in the US have portended an upsurge in right-wing or neo-fascist politics globally, which we could see in the invitations extended to Argentina's far-right president, Javier Milei, and Italy's neo- or post-fascist Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. Now, while Hall's conjunctural analysis was key to naming the moment of neoliberalism, we're living in an interregnum where it no longer commands the consent it once did. Neoliberalism has created the conditions of existence for the authoritarian and fascist nationalisms of our time. In this explosive moment, Hall's political writings provide important criteria for reading our conjuncture. So I began this talk with a suggestion that Hall's writing could be translated into the present. I want to conclude by underscoring that Hall's relevance, and I'm going to quote him here, is less in his vocabulary. He's referring to Gramsci, right? And which would, as he put it about Gramsci, and I'm saying it about Hall, offer us the consoling and appropriate quotation, close quote, and more as method, which derived its explanatory power from a specific conjuncture, but was not fixed to its time or place. His method for studying racisms and authoritarian nationalisms developed during the 70s and 80s can be adapted, modified, translated into the United States and the world in the 2020s, and as both Gramsci and Hall emphasized, it's upon the terrain of the conjunctural that the forces of opposition can organize. So thank you very much. Thank you, Krishna.
Oh, Can everybody hear me? Yes. That was fantastic, Jordan. Really, really interesting and thought-provoking. And I think that I have this sort of, I think, set of ideas in my head that I'm not certain all line up. And so I want you to help me line them up. Because on the one hand, I find your analysis of, the moment, which is a moment of force rather than the achievement of hegemony. And I find your analysis of the proposed terms really, really convincing. So your analysis to the crisis of failed wars, COVID-19, the end of the notion of liberal interventionism in the world. 2008 you didn't talk about as much, but the the extraordinary inequality and hopelessness in our society, and I find and the proposed rebuilding then around alliances that demonize immigrants and trans people in particular. That all strikes me as really convincing. At the same time, I see a different trend, which I guess I imagine as kind of a longer durée racial capitalist trend, which is the generalization of the terms of dominance that, this is following Césaire, right, of the terms of dominance that white people and Europeans and capitalists have inflicted on the rest of the world, on the marginalized, on the imperialized, on the racialized, to the population as a whole, right? And so whereas you have a justification of the destruction of the government as is rooting out of DEI, if you sit down and read the list of the 2,600 government programs and departments they were going to close, still will close, once the Congress lines up. So many of those are hands out to white people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're protection for lobster fishermen in Maine. And so I guess I just want you to help me kind of think through that aspect in relationship to your analysis, the aspect of the generalization of derogation, criminalization, and abandonment, expropriation to the population as a whole, which seems to me to be the way that our society had been going, right?
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Walter, and I can think of no one better to ask a question about the long history of racial capitalism than you. I guess what I would say first is that, my understanding of both Gramsci and Hall is sometimes when we talk about the conjuncture, people think we mean the present, now, right? But what I understand the method to be doing is to enable understandings of both the longue durée of racial capitalism, as you put it, and what's specific. And what Gramsci argues, and Hall really picks up on this in that analysis of situation section of the notebooks, right, is you have to get the organic and the conjunctural right. So I don't think that Hall or Gramsci would have denied the pervasive persistence of white supremacy, of settler colonialism, but they would want to think about how those things altered and changed and took different shapes. And I know you're attentive to that as well, but I think one of the things that you're talking about with the generalization of these dynamics of domination, increasing inequality, is exactly what Trump and right-wing authoritarianisms are able to whip up. Look at, more white people going to prison, right? The epicenter, as Judah Shep says in his book, around prison expansions now in the American Southeast and places like Eastern Kentucky. Things change, and we have to be attentive to that. And I think, the failure of a number of scholars and journalists to attend, I think, to those dynamics has created a kind of political vacuum that the right's been able to exploit by as much as anything else creating a kind of narrative that seems to make sense for people. I think that's where the whole globalism rhetoric needs to be taken quite seriously, not because we think it's rational or correct, but I think it helps us understand the relationship, as I understand your question, between the generalization and the challenges of the far right. So I would want to talk to you more about this, but that would be my at least provisional answer to a question that I know I'll be wrestling with for some time. So I hope I do it some justice. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought that was really good, very generative.
I don't know if the mic's on.
I think it is.
It is? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in there, and I'm trying to sort of pull out a couple of threads. One is a question, which is, to what extent is this presentation and this work in conversation with Gillian Hart's work? Right, including her most recent essay in Antipode, which I'm sure you've read. It's called Modalities of Conjunctural Analysis.
Yes.
Which makes a very similar move as you, but in the opposite direction, right? So you're in some ways following, I would say, your Aufhebungen. You're like sublating Gramsci via Hall and really like sticking with Hall. Hart does the other thing.
Right.
Hart goes back to Gramsci in order to deal with the question that I think Walter was kind of raising, which is multiplicity, temporal multiplicity, spatio-temporal heterogeneity. What is conjunctural analysis in terms of its scalar dispositions, both spatially and temporally, right? And then that leads me to a second question, which is more of a provocation, which is that I'm thinking of the sort of politics of method and epistemology implied in this talk, which I really appreciate, and I think it's really important, especially in light of these recent discussions in the American historical profession around so-called presentism. And the way I think about Gramsci's approach to the conjuncture, via the ways, why sort of Stefan Kipfer and Hart and how they have explained Gramsci's conjuncture, is that it is all presentism. And the question is, what is your presentism, right? And what does your presentism entail concretely in political terms? So I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the sort of politics of the politics of conjunctural analysis, in addition to the sort of use of conjunctural analysis as a kind of analytical frame or methodological apparatus.
Yeah, well, these are great questions. And I mean, the first is to say, extensive dialogue with Gillian Hart. If you see my footnotes, it's multiple. I think I must have said her name in the talk twice. But an actual dialogue as well. I've interviewed her for this podcast, Conjuncture. We organized a conference on Gramsci at UC Berkeley in 2023. And I've been, literally developing my insights in a kind of direct dialogue with her. That essay, which yes, I've read, multiple times as a draft, Modalities of Conjunctural Analysis, is really important for the reasons that you say. And I guess it's true. I'm a little more sympathetic to Hall's read. One thing that I try to do in the longer essay, to get in the weeds, people just read this essay. It appeared in Antipode 2024, and a really important look at how Hall developed his read of Gramsci, in dialogue with a number of thinkers across the global South, and not through Althusser. She has a critique of Althusser. And I guess I'm a little more sympathetic to Hall's approach, but one thing that remains in this essay, and I hear from your question, is disentangling, some of that Althusserianism, right? Which I won't get into now, right? But I just say thanks for that, a really great observation. Yeah, and like Hall, I think of this work as a kind of history of the present. I guess working in American studies, I don't have to get banged over the head as much about my alleged presentism. But, I kind of follow the injunction of the figures that you're talking about, and particularly from Gramsci, to always historicize and spatialize, right? And I think that approach, the method, the analytic, can help us in, I think, engaging in what I would like to promote as a kind of conjunctural turn. And the study of racism and capitalism, or racial capitalism, if you like. And I think that approach doesn't deny the long-term structural, but it exactly gets at what you said, which this, as Malik, Kiefer, Hart, and others, the coexistence of multiple temporal, spatial, right, moments, and reading that coexistence. So elements of the past come back in front of us. We see colonial horrors. We see the persistence of racism as a kind of unbroken chain, but we also see new dynamics, right? And I just think that unpacking that, for me, is one of the challenges. But I would just extend it as an invitation. There's great new work. I know that Walter and Vince Brown was just teaching Lucky Valley that Catherine Hall wrote, and I think that inaugurates a kind of moment of conjunctural histories of racial capitalism, a term she uses in that book. So that's what I would like to promote as a kind of intervention, the conjunctural turn.
Thank you, Jordan. That was really rich, really generative. One of the things that I was thinking about while you were talking was this kind of moment when Hall is like writing for Marxism Today, kind of a bit later on than like the main period that you're focused on, and the kind of one of the critiques that's often laid at his door from the left is that he was like to some extent kind of complicit in New Labour, and that the New Times project, you know, took a step in the wrong direction. And I think I was just sort of thinking about, you know, the dire state of the UK political scene now, and obviously I don't think it's fair to like put all of that on him, but I just wanted to ask you what you kind of made of that moment, and yeah, like kind of what the defense would be in a sense, or I think, you know, there's something kind of written into the understanding of his work as something that's happening in this conjunctural moment and through present forces. I just wanted to like find out how that kind of fit for you.
Well, one, thanks for the question, Phoebe, and I'm really excited to continue our dialogue about our interest in Hall. I mean, let me just make sure I understand the question about Hall's writing on New Labour and him being complicit and kind of legitimating Blair and the rest of that. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that that's something of an unfair characterization, a bit harsh for my read of what Hall was up to. Because as a theorist of politics, I do think that he showed that it was eminently practical to, if you're going to think about hegemony and you're going to live in Britain, then you have to think about the Labour Party and the Tories and everything. And so, you know, he often, I think some of those criticisms, you know, go back to the miners' strike in '83 and, you know, the kind of New Times thesis for him and Martin Jakes, and, you know, that they're like providing kind of left cover for a neoliberal project or something like that. But that does just strike me as a bit name-calling, you know? I mean, I think he was trying to, you know, understand politics as they actually unfolded, right? And to do so, it required attention to these, you know, complex interventions. I've not done a close study of his writings on labor, but I do know Nick Beach of the Stuart Hall Archive Project, who I know you know as well, has written an important essay that goes into this in more detail. So maybe I'll just encourage us all to read Nick Beach on this. But I guess the kind of short answer is it's a bit too harsh. You know.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I thought it was really interesting to put these three conjunctures together: Italy under Mussolini, the UK under Thatcher, the US under Trump now. And by the way, you know, Margaret Thatcher used that slogan, "Make Britain Great Again," right?
I should put that in there.
And so I take this idea of conjunctural analysis to, you know, and you talked about this sort of insistence on being precise, so as not to flatten out the differences between these different moments in time and space, right? And you know, hence the insistence that Thatcherism is not fascism. And I guess with that in mind, what I was wondering about is if you could say a little bit more about how you understand the concept of authoritarianism, which does sort of run through all three of them. Because if we take authoritarianism in some rough way to be sort of antithetical to democracy, and maybe that's too binary a way of thinking about it, I don't know, but if we do take it in that way, I mean, certainly if we had, a liberal political scientist in the room, like let's say Daniel Ziblatt from across the road, right? He would sort of, I think, refuse to accept that Thatcherism was authoritarian in the same way as Italian fascism and Trumpism is, right? And so, I guess what I'm asking is, are we, by which I mean, you and Stuart Hall, using the term authoritarianism a different way than that? And this slightly picks up on the conversation we were having just before we started, right? That in retrospect, is Thatcherism authoritarian in a slightly different way than these two things, fascism and Trumpism, which actually in some ways look more similar to each other.
Yes.
And Thatcherism stands out a little bit in some ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. It's a great question, and I'll try to do it some justice. I mean, the first is, I think the idea of conjunctural analysis is exactly to be precise historically and geographically. But if you look at those writings that Gramsci's doing, he's also looking at the long term. I mean, for him, again, a conjuncture can go from the French Revolution to the Paris Commune. And as long as you're in the same period and you get the same kind of resolutions of crisis, you're still in the same conjuncture. I think that, that's really important to understand about his method, right? It's precise, but it can also, cover a century, right? Sometimes in a few paragraphs if you're reading him closely. So I want to be clear about that. It's a way of kind of naming a period and a moment, but it's not simply a decade or something like a more traditional periodization among historians. So how I understand authoritarianism? I mean, it's a really brilliant question. The short version is, I think alongside, and this is probably my last go at it, alongside totalitarianism and the Cold War, it mostly becomes a kind of thing that's somebody else. It's those countries of the South or the Third World at the period, right? Not the global North. So, in that sense, and Michael Denning made this point recently that, Hall's, picking up on work by Ernesto Laclau and others describing these features in the global South, essentially, and then applying them to global North. So in that sense, it's a bit of a scandal, right? But I think it is, Hall was very clear. He did not think that this was fascism, although in Policing the Crisis, some of those quotes I pull out about the National Front, he is basically saying these are post-war forms of fascism. So it's not that he didn't see elements of continuity, but he just, I think, was against a kind of lazy thinking that just kind of plopped things down from different periods and expected, right, to explain things. And he's frustrated with the left for doing that kind of thing, And I do think, finally, that you're right. And I was trying to suggest that in the end in raising those questions. Is Trump authoritarian populist, or is he a neo-fascist? That, in fact, we do see quite a bit of continuity with that 20s and 30s period. And I raise this question, some historians, Enzo Traverso and others, use this concept of post-fascism, right? Which I understand because they don't want to get into analogizing. This is like Germany in 32 or something like this. But they want to get at the direct lineage of fascism, and he's a European intellectual historian, right? The post thing, I don't know, kind of confuses things for me, and that's the reason I lean into neo-fascism, and Paul Gilroy used this term neo-fascist common sense, which I think is a generative way to both get at some significant, because nonetheless, with analogies, you do have to compare some with those periods in order to kind of understand it, right? And so there are continuities and then there are breaks, that's what I would say, but it still takes a specific form, and I'm really grateful for the thoughtful question and hope we can continue it. I'll take it. Let's go. As long as I can drink water.
Hi. So I had a question actually about what's unique about this historical moment, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, or maybe thinking about the way in which propaganda and social media is working at this moment in different ways, and perhaps, I mean, it just seems like that's one way in which this is very different from previous historical moments in how siloed Americans are in their information, the information streams that they are getting, and then having those reinforced by algorithms that promote, that encourage outrage. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk more about that dynamic as really contributing to this shift to authoritarianism.
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and that's, the social media context is absolutely, these new technological developments are one of the things. Hall and his colleagues writing this stuff like 50 years ago, and so I think we have to be attentive. And if we're really going to do it, I have a student that I'm directing a thesis for now that's actually, going through this stuff and doing the homework. I haven't developed the kind of focus to go through Truth Social and whatever else. But, it's absolutely key, as you say, for thinking about it. And we would need to kind of build that up with an archive, and develop new methods for thinking about the specific ways in which it's altered the landscape for mass media, for the production of common sense, and so on. I'm not equipped to say everything about how the algorithms particularly help create an echo chamber, right? So it's kind of a novice. But I do think, that translating Gramsci and Hall into the present would have to, deal with these dynamics. You see it with, people can own the formerly Twitter and now be access to private information. All these things are rapidly unfolding. And so I guess my response is just say you're right. It's an invitation to do more investigation around the specific ways that this alters, the way that common sense is produced and so on. So I'll think about if there's ways that I can do that even in this chapter, and I appreciate the observation and the question.
Jordan, thank you for this presentation. I see you didn't run out of oil last night.
Yeah, that's right. I was here a little late.
So I have 3 short questions,
Yes.
if you'll be so kind. One, how are we so fortunate here at the Hutchins Center to get 2 Stuart Hall presentations in one semester?
Yes.
Is it the anniversary of his death, the decade anniversary of his death, or it just happens? Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
I was thankful for your commitment to clarity during your presentation, and I wanted to know, in your opinion, why don't analyses of race that are dense and labyrinthine replace one elite with another?
Let me make sure I understand the question. But one, I feel so fortunate to have another Hall scholar here to be able to bounce ideas off of. So thanks to the Hutchins
Yeah, it's
Center
extra
for-
pressure, right?
Yeah, it is, right? I was like, oh my God, she already covered this. I'm writing that out of the talk, But why don't analyses of race that are dense and complicated elaborate? Say the last part.
Replace one elite with another.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that I can kind of riff on what you're saying, but I think that if I'm interpreting your question correctly, you mean, why don't critical analyses of race replace one elite with another? Okay, I'll take a stab at it. I think what Hall was getting at with his critical and dense, elaborate theoretical analyses of race and racism and this kind of emergent post-colonial or neoliberal moment was precisely to think about, complicated new dynamics around race and class where, for example, I found in his archive, Harry, a speech about Walter Rodney that he never published, right? You know the story with, Forbes Burnham in Guyana having Rodney assassinated, right? And he was a black nationalist figure, right? Who was, what Rodney described as an authoritarian, right? Those are kind of new dynamics where an elite was in power that led to his murder. And Hall was writing about it before his murder. He had moved to Guyana from Tanzania, where he taught at Dar es Salaam, you know? And he had a position in the history department. And when he got there, they rescinded his offer. He was unemployed. Pat Rodney, his wife, said they'd already put down money on a house, you know? They had moved there, right? And Forbes Burnham felt so challenged by Rodney that he removed him from his post. And he had to spend the next several years traveling around the world, giving lectures at like SUNY Binghamton and Michigan and Frankfurt and so on to survive. And so these post-colonial, dynamics, right, of kind of elite transition, as some people have put it, I think encouraged Hall and other anti-racist and radical thinkers of that period to try to get at what was going on in terms of, people had freed themselves from colonialism, and that was an advance, but there were new contradictions, new challenges. So people didn't want to go back. There's nobody in the Caribbean or Africa that wanted to go back to colonialism, but there were historically specific new developments. And if I understand your question right, at least the way I'm interpreting it, I think that's what Hall and kind of that generation of thinkers were having to deal with. And it's one of the reasons that, he starts elaborating this method. Yeah. But we can talk more because we're neighbors.
Absolutely, yes, right. And finally, I was encouraged when you spoke of race being the modality through which class is lived. I thought that my question would be received well. What types of mistreatment will a non-white person suffer because of their racial classification that they won't suffer because of their class?
That's a really insightful, question in relationship to that often quoted, insight of Hall's. And to get at what's precise about, look at it as like this, right? Like, you have working people of different racial and national backgrounds in a country like the U.S. But I think, for example, the racist exclusion of migrant workers leads them to face challenges, right, that white workers who were born in the United States would not face, right? Namely, the hanging threat of deportation, of detention, of raids like the ones we've seen in Boston or in Chicago or in LA or, places all around the country, right? I've got my students, wondering where at a private liberal arts college they can go so ICE agents will not come and deport them, right? So that's a racist dynamic. You can be likewise poor, but you don't have the threat of being, and that, I think, requires our specific, ongoing attention to understand those dynamics, right? To theorize those dynamics, but also to try to confront those dynamics. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.